In today's Lost Media installment, we shall be discussing many of the Lost Dracula movies during the early age of cinema. One that was made next door to Transylvania, how Nosferatu could have been lost forever, the holy grail of lost horror movies, and a different ending for Bela Lugosi's Dracula. If this sounds like your cup of tea, then be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. With the context out of the way, let's dig up this coffin. As to what exactly was the first Dracula movie is a little bit blurred. As typical with early 20th century films, they were very poorly documented, with studios at the time having little priority to preserve them. Sometimes old written reviews and poorly decaying posters may be the only evidence left that a film did indeed once exist. There's been Dracula films reported to be as old as 1913, but with such scant evidence, it's hard to validate or confirm their existence. While we will never know for sure, let's at least talk about the oldest known Dracula movie. Made back in 1921 was the Hungarian film Dracula Halila. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, but around the world, it's most commonly known as Dracula's Death. The plot of this film follows a young lady called Mary who is locked up in an insane asylum. There she meets a man who claims to be the authentic Dracula. She frequently has nightmares of the unusual man. Eventually she's kidnapped by this character, brought back to his palace, locked up as a prisoner, and is forced into an elaborate marriage. This was a Hungarian and Austrian co-production, with the location footage being filmed in Vienna, and the studio sets were photographed in Budapest. The film was 60 minutes in length, premiering in Vienna and having a theatrical run around Europe. In 1923, the film was re-released and was renamed The Death of Dracula. The feature was reshot and re-edited with a new actress playing Mary. 100 years on, both versions of the film are now long gone, with the only remnants left are 3 grainy images and a couple of review articles. During the late 90s, a novelisation of the story was rediscovered in the Budapest Archival Library. A couple of years ago, you could purchase an English translation of the novel as a digital copy. Unfortunately though, it's no longer available to purchase. In 2019, the Sapien Hungarian University of Transylvania ambitiously remade the film only utilising camera technology that would have been available during the original. July 10th of the same year, the university held a special screening for the press. As of 2020, the remake is not currently available to view anywhere. In 1922, a year after Dracula's death, saw the release of Nosferatu, created by the German film company Prouded Films, who had tried but failed to acquire the rights to adapt the book. Still wanting their Dracula movie, they took some creative license and inspiration so it would be similar but not exactly the same as the book. Such as the name Count Dracula was changed to Count Orlok. The sunlight described in the book only weakens vampires, but is absolutely deadly in the film. This Achilles heel has now become engraved within vampire mythology. Prouded Films hoped that by departing with these aspects, that the film would be different enough from the book to avoid any copyright infringement. And for a brief period, they had seemed to avoid detection, as Nosferatu had a very successful run in Germany, and plans for more horror adaptations from Prouded Films were already on the way, although that was cut very short. After a poster proclaimed it to be an adaptation on Bram Stoker's Dracula, his widow caught notion of this and sought to take out legal action by suing the company into bankruptcy, making Nosferatu its one and only film. A court ruling that every copy of the film must be disposed of, although the film did make it overseas to the States. Never being registered in America, Dracula was public domain. The film was freely shown around in the country during the late 20s. With the cult success of Nosferatu, Universal took notion of this, and had their own ideas of a Dracula adaptation carrying on the horror success since the silent era of film. To seem more commendable, Universal gained permission from Bram Stoker's widow, and she agreed, under the conditions that if they could permanently get rid of Nosferatu in the States. Universal complied and purchased every copy on the market, but would secretly keep some of the prints for themselves to study and analyse for their own adaptation. In 1932, they would use clips from Nosferatu and many of the horror films for a short film called Boo. including the 1931 Frankenstein, and a now lost horror sound film called The Cat Creeps. Clips of the movie only survive thanks to the short film. While Nosferatu was nearly permanently destroyed, one copy evaded detection and circulated for years. By the 1960s, Dracula had elapsed into the public domain around the globe. Nosferatu could finally be freely shown outside of the US. And it turned out Nosferatu did indeed survive outside of the States, as various copies reappeared all over Europe, allowing the film to be extensively restored. The film since has been re-evaluated as one of the greatest horror films of its day. Not as many silent films were truly as lucky as Nosferatu, as in terms of not only surviving to present day, but having mainstream success, such as notably having a remake in 1979, and another in 2000, the most recent of which, titled Shadow of the Vampire, is about the making of the original Nosferatu, reinterpreting the events of the behind-the-scenes troubles that the title character was really a vampire. It's been wondered by modern horror fans as to why Dracula's Death didn't garner so much attention. Was it that it didn't really follow the book? Did Bram Stoker's widow never heard of it? Perhaps given the age of Dracula's Death, maybe the real answer has been lost to time. Lon Chaney was a renowned actor back in the 20s, playing characters that were not only physically demanding, but having to perform as all types of monsters and ghouls, occasionally being placed under tons of heavy makeup. His makeup artist was himself. Having an extensive supply within his makeup box, he became quite the desirable actor, as he could supply the studio with their monster. In 1927, he played a vampire, but unlike his other roles, the character he plays within the picture deliberately disguises himself as a vampire, as he's a detective that's trying to work out a murder mystery, trapping his suspects in a derelict house where the murder took place, frightening them into submission to confess that they caused the murder. The film was titled London After Midnight. Upon release, it wasn't given very favourable reviews. The film was placed under a harsh spotlight after being accused for inspiring a real murder. Between the 30s and the 60s, the film was rarely reshown and was practically forgotten about. By the mid-60s, the last known copy was destroyed in a vault fire at the MGM archives. Frustrating for MGM at the time, as they were trying to extensively archive their library. With early film photographed on nitrate, it was easily combustible and flammable, leading to a lot of trial and error with early preservation, and sadly, many grand losses. Following several decades later, film historians, but especially Monster magazine, would romanticize Lon Chaney as the horror star, the man of 1,000 faces, introducing a new generation to the long-gone actor. Many of his features were within the public domain, and easily accessible, his new fan base just ate them up. There is quite a long list of lost Lon Chaney movies, many of which he directed himself, but craving to see another monster movie from the actor, London After Midnight piqued their interest. So began a long, hard search for the film. Over 90 years later, the film that hardly wowed audiences was becoming the most sought-after lost horror movie. Despite being a lost film, it's perhaps more widely known than any of the Lon Chaney movies that actually survived to present day. Until the day that if the film is ever rediscovered. The best way to experience the story is either watch the 1935 remake Mark of the Vampire, starring Bela Lugosi as the role as the vampire disguise. Both films were directed by the same person. Or, in 2002, you can watch the reconstruction made by Turner Classic Movies, utilising the original script and surviving photographs. Although it has been criticised as being a bit hard to follow, a far cry from the standards of loose cannon reconstructions, just as an example to show that it can be done, recreating the original media by using surviving fragments of the original. Harkening back to the 20s when Universal had aspirations of making their own version of Dracula, they wanted to cast Lon Chaney as the title role. But by the end of the decade, Lon Chaney had switched contracts with MGM, being unable to participate in the project. MGM would star Lon Chaney in his first sound movie. Shortly before filming began, Chaney found out that he had throat cancer. Unholy 3 was his final movie. Just as sound movies were coming to fruition, Universal would move forward with their version of Dracula, casting Bela Lugosi as the titled character. Universal gaining permission to adapt the Dracula book makes this film the first official adaptation of the Dracula novel, and additionally with the feature being the first installment of the Universal Monster series, as this incarnation of Dracula would later on go off to encounter the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster. To date, the Universal Monster features are still the most iconic portrayals of the characters. Notable assets from Dracula is his red cape and Lugosi's Hungarian accent, largely being the image that everybody associates with the character, even though the 1931 film is not the most faithful adaptation. During production, there were two versions made of the film. One with an English-speaking cast with Lugosi, then during the evenings a Spanish crew would film on the same set, filming the same movie but in their respected language. The Spanish crew had the advantage of seeing dailies of the English version, adjusting and tweaking shots for their own project. Notably, the Spanish movie runs for an extra 20 minutes in length, revealing that there was quite a bit cut from the original, with fans of the movie theorising that there's more cut from the movie, such as trying to elaborately explain as to why there's a torn up bit of cardboard in the centre of one shot. But the most infamous lost cut, a final speech by the character Van Helsing, who appears after the movie concludes, hoping that the film won't give anybody bad dreams, ending the short monologue remarking, "Remember, there are such things." When Dracula was re-released in 1936, the production code had came into effect, essentially policing the content in movies. The outro monologue was demanded to be cut out, and while many Universal monster movies had the same cuts upon re-releases, they've all been fully restored upon home media releases, with the exception of Dracula. The monologue hadn't been seen not until 1999's documentary The Road to Dracula, where a small snippet was played by the end of the documentary. Universal has never given confirmation as to the exact state that the original scene is now in, nor if it ever will be fully restored back into the film.
And remember, after all,
there are such things.
There are such things.
there are such